Welcome back to Mr. News Art Class. It's wonderful to see your smiling faces today. The weekly beginner art tutorial videos that I did last month were all about how to draw what you see. But in all of those videos, I used nothing but regular pencils. For this month, the month of March 2017, I'd like to start taking you on a journey of color. Here I have a collection of colored pencils from my Prismacolor set. Now I happen to own a box with 120 different colors, but this box A is not available anymore. They don't make this particular box anymore. Instead they make a 132 set. And B, even more importantly, is way more than you need to get started with. So what I've done here is I have selected out the colors that come in the Prismacolor 12 pack, and those colors are violet blue, crimson red, true blue, white, orange, dark brown, sienna brown, violet, apple green, grass green, canary yellow, and black. You can tell which one I use the most. Now there is absolutely no need for a beginner artist to go get these expensive Prismacolor brand. If you're just starting out, a good starter brand is the simple Crayola, and the Crayola 12 pack would have very similar colors as well. But there are two things that I suggest getting in addition to your colored pencils. One is a colorless blender. It's exactly the same material as a colored pencil. It's a waxy center core, except it has no colored pigment added. And the last thing I suggest having is a good quality pencil sharpener. Colored pencils in particular don't do too well with cheap pencil sharpeners. Over the years, I personally have amassed quite a few of these regular handheld pencil sharpeners, as well as electric pencil sharpeners and the hand crank kind that you see in elementary schools. But this right here, I have found is the best pencil sharpener for colored pencils. This is a Koom, K-U-M, what they call automatic long point sharpener. And I'll show you with one of my other pencils what it does and how it works. It's two steps. The first one sharpens the wood, and the second one sharpens the lead. So as you can see here, that lead has been sharpened to where the lead is really long and straight. And then I put it in the second step, and it's going to sharpen that lead to a nice sharp point. Now it does say automatic long point sharpener. The automatic part doesn't mean that it's electric and it sharpens the pencil for you. What it means is it has this stopper here that will stop you from sharpening it to where the lead is way too long. Again, links are always in the description for all the supplies that I use in these videos, and they are affiliate links, which means if you click them and you buy these supplies, it just gives me a tiny percentage that I can use to buy more supplies for videos to make for you. Today I'm going to be working on this lettering work that I've done here, which I drew with a pencil and then traced over with my 08 fine liner pen, Prismacolor fine liner. If you'd like to learn some tricks for how to use colored pencils, how to blend colors and things like that, You don't have to be using the same words or the same picture here. You can get any kind of picture to practice with, or even just a series of boxes to color in. And we'll talk about a lot of different ways to use colored pencils. Feel free to follow along or just watch and learn. Either way, I hope you learned something useful today. What I'm going to do is, for this word up here, education, I'm going to show you a whole bunch of different ways to color. But I'm really just going to show you the progression from how we start through learning different styles of coloring and on to advanced coloring techniques. When we're toddlers or babies or kindergartners or preschoolers, we always start with scribbling. And I know that looks ugly. I know it looks horrible because I'm not a kindergartner or a preschooler anymore. But in this discussion, it's important to note where we start. Then there are times when we've grown a little bit and we understand that this doesn't look good, but we don't know a better way to do it, so we choose not to color. And then, eventually, we learn how to slow down. And we learn how to move our pencil or our crayon or our marker in the same direction that the line goes, so that we can get inside the lines without going over the edges, and so that we can fill a whole shape all the way, neatly and evenly. And then, a little bit later, we discover that if we push down harder, we get a much darker, deeper color. And we can still go inside the lines. We can still move our colored pencil the same direction as the lines so that we can get right next to the lines without going over the edge. But because we're pushing down harder, we get a much deeper, more vivid color. And then one day we have an art teacher who teaches us that when we color, it makes lines back and forth. And if we can color a whole picture with all the lines going back and forth in the same direction, that can create an interesting feel to the whole picture. And so we start to try getting all the way to the edges without going over the edges, but while still keeping our pencil or crayon or marker moving one direction the whole time. But it's really hard to do when you've got thin lines like this and a pencil that isn't completely sharp. I end up leaving little white areas around the outline, around the border of this shape that don't get colored because I'm too busy trying to focus on getting these diagonal lines with my coloring. And the other thing that we start to notice at about that same time is that the further you zoom out, the further you step away, the harder it is to see these pale colors. And that letter C there that is so dark and vibrant has so much contrast against the background that it's really easy to see. Ha ha. It's really easy to see the C. And as we zoom back in and we take a closer look, we can try to figure back out how to overcome this problem, but not necessarily have such a dark color. Maybe we want to keep a lighter, softer tone, but make it more visible from a distance. And this is when we start to learn how to blend colors. Maybe I want to mix these two colors together to make a blue-green. Maybe I'm stuck with a 12-color set here, and I can't just look through my set here to find a blue-green color that I want. So I need to mix two colors together to make it happen. And this is when we discover that shading in lines, even though we used to have an art teacher telling us to do it, might not be the best way. So instead, we start to shade in circles, coloring in circles. Tight circles that can get right up next to the edges of the shape without going over the lines. And because they're circles instead of lines, I don't have to worry about going the same direction every time, and I don't have to worry about going the same direction as the lines of my shape. All I have to do is wiggle in a circular motion. And if I colored the first one lightly enough, I can put a second color on top of it using the same circular motion. And those two colors will start to blend together. Now, as it is, that's about the best you can expect from just a normal Crayola box of colored pencils. But no matter what brand of colored pencils you're using, if you go get yourself a colorless blender, you can take this one step further. And once you've got yourself a colorless blender, I'm going to do the same circular motion with this colorless blender that I did with those two colors. And I'm going to push down just a little bit while I do that. Not too much, just a little bit. And you start to see that those two colors are blending together. And now that color is much softer than this harsh, dark green. But because of the way we've used circles to color it, and because of the way we used two different colors and blended it with the colorless blender, it still gets the vibrance without overpowering the whole picture. A similar effect can be achieved by using a color with a white, and this will create a much more pastel color. When we say pastel colors, if you're not familiar with that term, it just means like the kinds of colors you would expect to see in a baby's nursery. Very soft colors that aren't too vivid, aren't too vibrant. Or perhaps you might see these kinds of colors in Easter eggs or Easter outfits. They're really pale, soft colors. So what I've done here is I've started the same way I started this one, very lightly using circles. But instead of adding a second color and using a colorless blender, I'm just going to use a white to blend the color that's already there. And by adding this white to it, and I'm pushing down relatively hard here with the white, what happens is you can see, if you look up close where you've shaded lightly with your colored pencil, you can see little dips and crevices in the paper. That's called the tooth of the paper. And what happens when you start to blend with a white like this, or really if you're pushing hard with any color or the colorless blender, pushing down like that gets into all of those crevices and grooves. But by using a white to do it, I'm not making the color any darker or more colorful. I'm keeping the value of the color the same, or maybe lightening it just a hair. But really what this white does is it just pushes that pigment down into the grooves of the paper, the tooth of the paper, and makes it fill that space much more evenly. And that gets us a nice soft pastel color by mixing white with any other color. On the opposite end of the value scale, I could mix a black with my green. To do that, we need to understand first that black is an extremely powerful pigment, and you only need a little bit of that to darken something up a whole lot. Whereas the white, it took a whole lot of pressure with the white to get a lighter value on that green. But the black, I'm just barely going to touch to this next letter. So to make this darker, I'm going to add just a little bit of black. And again, I'm very softly and gently using circles to add this black. I do not want to add too much black. It only takes a very small amount of black to make that a whole lot darker. Now, I'm going to go back to my original color, and now use this to blend. And if that didn't get it quite as dark as I wanted it to, I can always go back and add more black. Once you've added some black, it's very hard to make it brighter, but it's always easy to add more black to make it darker. And when I do this, I always like to go back over the black with my color again because I want it to still be this color, just a darker version of it. And you see how adding more black made this top and left part darker than the bottom and right part. And now I'm going to have quite a bit of fun with that letter N. I'm going to make that letter N appear to be three-dimensional, like there's a light source shining on it and it's kind of round and curved, by having dark areas, bright light areas, and areas where it's mixed with another color. For starters, I want the whole letter to be green, because that's kind of what I've gone with here. So I'm going to use my light, soft circles to fill the whole letter. Then, I want to spot where the brightest highlights are going to be, so I need to know where my light's shining from. Maybe my light is shining down and in from the top right, down towards the bottom left. And that means the top right sections of each part of my letter are going to have a little highlight. So I'll use the white to draw in little highlights, and I'm pushing down quite hard with the white here. Maybe all along the top edge of this diagonal there's going to be a highlight. Maybe right there there's going to be a highlight. And maybe a little bit there. And maybe a little bit there. And then around the highlights I'm going to see a brighter color, like a yellow, a more warm tone. And I don't want too much of this, but I just want a little bit of this around that highlight. Not on that highlight, but around that highlight. Then I want to figure out where my darkest darks are going to be. If my bright highlights were on the top right edges where the light was shining directly onto them, the darkest edges are going to be on the bottom left edges where the light is not shining. Again, I don't want too much black for those shadows, but I want to add enough to make those shadows look deep. That will help to give a roundness to my letters here. And then I want to add my blue, my cool tone, around the shadows. Then I want to come back with my green again, the color I started with, and get the space between the shadows and the highlights just a little bit darker, still not pushing down totally too hard, but just trying to sort of blend from my yellow to the blue to the black. I'm trying to leave alone the bright white highlights though. I'm just trying to get a little bit more green on the rest of this letter before I break out the Colorless Blender. And mostly I'm doing this because I don't want the shadows to look too black. I want them to look like they're still green, but just a darker green. And then I'm ready to break out the Colorless Blender. And here, if I'm doing all these different value variations, I want to start my Colorless Blending with the lightest value. So I'm going to take this white with the yellow around it, and I'm just going to kind of make circles around it, everywhere that I've got that yellow and white going on. Then I want to get the edges where the yellow meets the green. And I always work from lightest to darkest when I do this. So right here I'm just trying to blend in the yellow to the green. And then I can start blending towards the blue and the black. So I started with my brightest brights first, and then worked my way to the darkers. And that gives the illusion that there's a light shining down onto this letter from above. All done with a couple of colored pencils. And like I said, this Colorless Blender goes a long way to making that happen. but it's not a requirement. You can do it with just the colored pencils too if you layer them properly. This tool just makes it a little quicker and easier. I've also seen some other artists use these colorless blender markers, whether it's Prismacolor or the Copic or other brands. I've seen people use these colorless markers to get a similar effect to what the colorless blender pencil does. And that's because these markers are alcohol-based, and the alcohol dissolves the wax that's in colored pencils. Colored pencils are waxy, kind of like crayons, and the alcohol in these markers dissolves that wax and can spread it around quite a bit. But I've never actually used these for that. I've used these for blending markers, but not for blending colored pencils. While I'm talking about color, I did want to also mention that black and brown and gray and white are often left out when people talk about color. Those are the neutral colors, and they are colors. We should consider them to be colors, and we should use them like colors. So everything I just did here with these green letters can be done with black letters. If I wanted to make black letters look three-dimensional, I could add bright white highlights that would mix in with the black to make a gray. And I could make the deepest, darkest parts slightly darker than the middle parts. So for example, with simply just these two colored pencils, black and white, I might color some letters completely in, but very gently, then use my white to make the brightest highlights, then go back with my black to get the deepest, darkest shadows, and then be softer and gentler with my black as I blend through the rest of the letter to make it slightly lighter, and then also go over it very lightly and softly with my white to blend and make a gray for that in-between tone. And then just make sure that I go back and darken up my darkest darks and lighten up my brightest brights. Now that's all fine and dandy if you're wanting to just color solid color or color a shape to look like it's three-dimensional. But one thing that we often forget is that when we have separate shapes nearby each other, we could color the insides of those shapes to make a picture out of those letters or out of those shapes. So what I'm going to try to do here is make a little sunset that is not overlapped behind the letters, but inside the letters. In this drawing here, I used pretty much all of these different methods except for the Scribble Scrabble, of course. I did choose to leave white areas uncolored. I did start everything lightly and then push harder to get deeper, darker tones. I did a lot of color blending, some highlight blending to make brighter versions of my colors, some shadow blending to make darker versions of my colors, and some where I combined both to make highlights and shadows to make a three-dimensional feel. If you enjoyed this little brief introduction to color today, stay tuned for the rest of the month of March, where I'll be talking about color wheels, mixing colors, how to use warm and cool colors, and how to think colors expressively to show feelings and emotions. My weekly beginner tutorial sessions are released every Thursday, and if you're interested, I also release Zentangle videos every Sunday. And in the Zentangle videos for this month, the month of March, I'm going to alternate back and forth between demonstrating how to draw patterns and using them in Zentangle drawings. If you're interested in following my beginner art tips or the Zentangle series, hit the subscribe button below and click the little notification bell so that you'll get reminders every time I release a new video. And again, just like always, there are links down in the description for all of the supplies that I used or talked about in this video. And those are affiliate links, which means that if you click through and buy something, you'll get the same price as everybody else, but I'll get a small percentage of that as a commission, which just helps me keep these videos coming to you. That's it for today, and as always, I hope I've inspired you today.